In the vast golden plains of the Serengeti, where the sun beats down mercilessly and survival is measured in heartbeats, a tragedy unfolded that would reshape the destiny of an entire lion family. 3 siblings, born under the same mother's watchful eyes, were about to experience a loss so devastating that it would drive them apart. But years later, when fate brought them back together, they would return as warriors, forged in the fires of vengeance and bound by a promise written in blood. This is not just a story of survival. This is a story of redemption, brotherhood, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a world where the weak are forgotten and only the strong endure. Before we dive deeper into this tale of brotherhood that will leave you absolutely speechless, tell me where you're watching this from. Drop your country in the comments below because we love hearing from our global pride. And if you want to witness more incredible true stories from the African wilderness that will blow your mind, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notification bell right now. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this epic saga. The year was 2008 in the heart of the Serengeti ecosystem. 3 lion cubs had just celebrated their first birthday, a milestone that most cubs never reach. Their names were Kavi, the eldest male with a golden mane already showing hints of darkness; Simba, the younger brother, smaller but quicker, with eyes that burned with fierce intelligence; and their sister Ayana, the only female of the trio, blessed with a grace that masked her deadly hunting instincts. They were the pride and joy of their mother, Zuri, a lioness of legendary status whose lineage stretched back generations of Serengeti royalty. The 3 siblings were inseparable. They played together in the tall grass, wrestling and tumbling over each other in the way that cubs do. They learned to hunt together, practicing their stalking techniques on unsuspecting grasshoppers and small birds. Their mother watched with pride as her children grew stronger with each passing day, their bodies hardening, their instincts sharpening, their confidence building. But there was a darkness gathering at the edges of their paradise. A coalition of 5 rogue male lions, exiled from their original pride, had been roaming the borderlands of Serengeti for months, growing hungrier and more desperate with each passing week. These were not ordinary lions. These were warriors, scarred and battle-hardened, driven by a hunger that went beyond food. They wanted territory, they wanted power, and they wanted to prove that they could take what belonged to others. The leader of this coalition was a massive male named Karanja, a beast of extraordinary size and cruelty. Rangers estimated his weight at nearly 500 pounds of pure muscle and malice. His left eye was scarred shut from an old battle, giving him a sinister appearance that struck fear into the hearts of every creature that crossed his path. Karanja had made a vow to himself that he would claim the richest territory in the Serengeti, the lands controlled by Zuri's pride. These lands were blessed with abundant prey, permanent water sources, and the best hunting grounds for miles around. On a scorching afternoon in August 2008, when the heat shimmered off the plains like liquid fire, Karanja and his coalition made their move. Zuri was away hunting with the other lionesses, leaving the 3 young cubs in the care of a single elderly guardian lioness named Amara. The cubs were playing near a dried riverbed, their playful roars and growls echoing across the grasslands. None of them heard the approach of the rogue males until it was far too late. Karanja appeared first, his massive silhouette blocking out the afternoon sun. Behind him came his 4 lieutenants, moving with the coordinated precision of predators who had practiced this exact scenario countless times before. The cubs froze. Instinct screamed at them that danger was approaching, but they were young, they were inexperienced, and they were woefully unprepared for what was about to happen. Amara, the elderly lioness, positioned herself between the cubs and the invaders, her weathered body already scarred from 100 battles. She roared with everything she had, a desperate warning that echoed across the plains. It was a sound of defiance, a last stand of an old warrior protecting the young. But Karanja barely slowed down. He swatted Amara aside with a single paw, a casual display of power that sent the elderly lioness crashing into the dust. She tried to rise, but her body had seen too many seasons, endured too many trials. She could only watch in horror as the nightmare unfolded before her. What happened next would haunt the 3 cubs for the rest of their lives. Karanja's coalition surrounded them, cutting off every possible escape route. Kavi, the eldest brother, tried to fight. He was young, but he was brave, and he threw himself at Karanja with a ferocity that momentarily surprised even the massive rogue male. But bravery is no match for experience and size. Karanja caught Kavi mid-leap and hurled him across the ground like a toy. The young lion's body crashed against the hard earth, the wind knocked from his lungs. Simba grabbed his sister and tried to run, but the other males closed in from all sides. For 3 terrifying minutes, the dried riverbed became a battlefield. The cubs screamed, the rogue males roared, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Simba managed to escape into the tall grass, dragging himself away from his attackers, his body bleeding from multiple wounds. Kavi, dazed and broken, staggered to his feet and followed, limping desperately toward the thickets. But Ayana, their beautiful sister, did not escape. She tried. She ran faster than she had ever run before, her small legs pumping frantically. But one of Karanja's lieutenants cut her off, grabbed her, and the horrible truth became crystal clear in that moment. When Zuri and the other lionesses returned from their hunt 3 hours later, they found a scene of devastation. Amara lay unconscious near the riverbed, bleeding from a dozen wounds. Kavi was limping in circles, his eyes glazed with shock and pain. Simba was nowhere to be found, and Ayana was gone, killed by the rogue males and dragged away to be consumed as a trophy, proof of Karanja's power and dominance. The cries that erupted from Zuri's throat that day were unlike anything the Serengeti had ever heard. A mother's grief, raw and primal, echoing across the plains for miles around. The lionesses of the pride gathered, their faces twisted with rage and sorrow. But there was nothing they could do. Karanja's coalition had already melted back into the shadows, and pursuit would be suicide. For days the pride searched for Ayana, hoping against hope that she had somehow survived, that she was hiding somewhere, waiting to be found. But the terrible truth was undeniable. She was gone forever. The loss devastated everyone, but for Kavi and Simba, the trauma was almost unbearable. They had failed to protect their sister. They had been too young, too weak, too inexperienced. The guilt festered inside them like a poison, eating away at their sense of self-worth and purpose. And so, when Simba finally emerged from the tall grass where he had hidden for 2 days, he was a changed lion. The playful cub was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, more dangerous. Kavi and Simba barely spoke to each other in the weeks that followed. The bond between them had been shattered along with their innocence. Kavi blamed himself for not being strong enough, for not fighting harder. Simba blamed himself for running, for abandoning his sister in her moment of greatest need. The two brothers grew distant, their shared trauma driving them apart rather than bringing them together. By the time they reached their 3rd birthday, they had become almost strangers to each other, 2 separate entities haunted by the same ghost. But within each of them, a single seed had been planted, a seed of purpose, a seed of vengeance, a seed that would grow year after year, consuming their thoughts, driving their every action. They each made a silent vow, alone in the darkness of the African night. They would become strong, stronger than Karanja, stronger than his entire coalition. They would survive long enough to cross paths with the rogue males again, and when that moment came, they would exact a price so terrible that the name Ayana would be spoken with reverence across the entire Serengeti, remembered not as a victim, but as a martyr who had inspired her brothers to achieve the impossible. The years passed. Kavi and Simba grew in isolation, driven by their individual quests for strength and power. Kavi drifted north, finding his way into a coalition of young males who taught him the brutal arts of territorial combat. He learned to fight not just with strength, but with strategy. He studied his opponents, learned to exploit weaknesses, understood that battles were won with intelligence as much as with muscle and claw. He earned scars, dozens of them, each one a lesson carved into his body in blood and pain. By his 5th year, Kavi had become a formidable warrior, respected and feared by every lion who encountered him. Simba, meanwhile, chose a different path. He stayed on the fringes of lion society, hunting alone, avoiding pride politics and territorial disputes. But in his solitude, he developed something that many lions never possess, the ability to think like his enemy. He spent months observing Karanja's coalition from a distance, watching their patterns, learning their weaknesses, understanding the dynamics of their group. He watched how Karanja dominated through fear and brutal displays of strength. He noted how the other males deferred to him, how they followed his lead without question. He observed that while Karanja was powerful, he was also proud, arrogant, believing himself invincible. Then, on a night when the stars burned bright in the African sky, something miraculous happened. Kavi and Simba, now fully grown males with magnificent manes, crossed paths near the Mara River. They hadn't seen each other in 4 years, For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, taking in the changes, recognizing in each other's eyes the same burning purpose that had sustained them through all these years. They approached slowly, cautiously, and then they touched noses in the traditional greeting. And in that moment, something shifted. The barriers that had kept them apart crumbled. The shared trauma, instead of dividing them, now united them. They had both survived. They had both become warriors. And together, they were unstoppable. That night, sitting beneath the stars with their sister's memory burning in their hearts, Kavi and Simba made a pact. They would find Karanja and his coalition. They would hunt them down, and they would make them pay for what they had taken. It was a promise that went beyond vengeance. It was a sacred oath, sworn in blood, witnessed by the spirits of their ancestors and the ghost of their beloved sister. The reunion between Kavi and Simba marked the beginning of something extraordinary. What had started as individual quests for strength and redemption now transformed into a unified mission, a brotherhood reforged in the crucible of shared purpose. Together, they were no longer just two traumatized cubs seeking revenge. They were a force of nature, a coalition bound by blood, loss, and an unbreakable oath to honor their fallen sister. But before they could challenge Karanja and his rogues, they needed to understand the full scope of what they were facing. The years had changed many things in the Serengeti, and they needed intelligence, strategy, and allies. For 3 months after their reunion, Kavi and Simba traveled through the vast plains together, relearning each other's movements, rebuilding the synchronization that siblings who grow up together naturally develop. They hunted side by side, coordinating their attacks with a precision that spoke of something deeper than mere experience. When one brother moved left, the other instinctively moved right, cutting off escape routes. When one attacked high, the other struck low. It was as if they shared a single mind housed in two powerful bodies. The prey animals of the Serengeti learned to fear the sight of these two magnificent males moving together, their dark manes flowing like shadows across the golden grass. But hunting wild antelope and buffalo was only part of their preparation. The brothers also needed to gather information about Karanja's current location and the composition of his coalition. This is where Simba's years of solitary observation proved invaluable. He had maintained a mental map of the territories controlled by the rogue males, had noted their migration patterns, understood the seasonal movements that dictated their behavior. Through careful reconnaissance and following the gossip that traveled through lion communities like wind through the grasslands, they learned that Karanja's coalition had grown to 7 males, not 5. 2 younger lions had joined the group, drawn by Karanja's reputation for success and dominance. More significantly, they learned that Karanja had claimed the very territory that their mother's pride had once controlled. The rogue coalition had successfully driven out most of the original Pride members through a series of brutal territorial conflicts. Zuri, their mother, had been killed in one of these battles 3 years earlier, defending the lands that had belonged to her family for generations. The news struck Kavi and Simba like a physical blow. They had been so focused on avenging their sister that they hadn't realized their mother had paid the ultimate price as well. The injustice of it, the senseless tragedy of it, crystallized their resolve into something harder and more unyielding. During this period of preparation, the brothers also sought out other lions, hearing rumors of powerful males who might be willing to join them in their quest. They understood that challenging a coalition of 7 without additional support would be suicide. Regardless of their individual strength and synchronization, they needed numbers, they needed allies, they needed warriors who had their own grudges against Karanja and his rogues. Their search led them to a part of the Serengeti they had never explored before, to the northern grasslands where a massive male named Jabari had recently established himself as the protector of several vulnerable lioness prides. Jabari was enormous, even larger than Karanja, with a mane so dark it appeared almost black in certain light. Scars covered his body like a map of 1,000 battles, each one telling a story of survival against impossible odds. When Kavi and Simba approached Jabari near a watering hole one early morning, they expected either a fight or a dismissal. Instead, the massive male simply nodded in recognition. Jabari had heard the rumors about the 2 brothers, the young lions who were traveling together with obvious purpose. He had watched them hunt, observed their coordination, understood what they were planning, and he had his own reasons for wanting to see Karanja brought down. Years earlier, before Karanja had become the leader of his rogue coalition, he had killed Jabari's son in a territorial dispute. The death had been senseless, the work of a younger Karanja still proving himself through brutality rather than wisdom. Jabari had mourned his son, had thought of revenge countless times, but had always held back, choosing instead to focus on protecting the innocent lionesses and their cubs. When Kavi and Simba explained their purpose, when they spoke of their sister Ayana and their mother Zuri, Jabari's eyes burned with something primal and ancient. Here, he realized, were young lions driven by the same loss that had haunted him for years. And here was finally an opportunity to turn that shared grief into action. Jabari agreed to join them, and in that moment, the balance of power in the Serengeti began to shift. With Jabari's addition, their coalition now numbered 3 formidable males. But the brothers wanted more. They sought out 2 additional warriors, brothers themselves named Amari and Darius, who had been exiled from their own pride by a tyrannical male who had taken over their territory through treachery and violence. Amari and Darius had been living on the margins, surviving on scraps and stolen kills, burning with the desire to prove themselves and reclaim their honor. When Kavi and Simba approached them with their proposition, the brothers immediately understood. This was their chance at redemption, their opportunity to fight for something greater than mere survival. By the time the dry season arrived 6 months after Kavi and Simba's reunion, a powerful coalition of 5 males had been assembled. They were not the largest coalition ever seen in the Serengeti, but they were perhaps the most formidable in terms of coordination and motivation. Each member had lost something to violence and injustice. Each member carried scars, both physical and emotional. Each member was driven by a purpose that transcended territorial ambition or hunger. They were warriors bound by oath, united in their determination to bring justice to the lands they had lost and honor to the names of the fallen. The brothers spent weeks training this coalition, teaching them the tactics that had worked so well in their own hunts. They demonstrated how to coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple angles, how to cut off escape routes, how to exploit the psychological weakness that comes when a predator realizes it is being hunted rather than hunting. They taught Jabari, Amari, and Darius about Ayana and Zuri, about the injustice that had been done, about the sacred nature of their mission. And as they trained, something remarkable happened. The individual males began to meld into something greater than the sum of their parts. They became a machine of devastating efficiency, a force that moved with singular purpose. But before they could confront Karanja's coalition, they needed to understand exactly where the rogue males were and what they were doing. Intelligence was everything. A poorly planned attack, executed at the wrong time against an unprepared enemy, could result in the deaths of Kavi, Simba, Jabari, Amari, and Darius. And that would mean Ayana's death would never be avenged, Zuri's sacrifice would be forgotten, and Karanja would continue his reign of terror unchecked. So Simba, drawing on his years of solitary observation skills, undertook a dangerous reconnaissance mission into the very heart of Karanja's territory. What he discovered was both encouraging and deeply disturbing. Karanja's coalition of 7 was indeed firmly entrenched in the territory that had once belonged to their mother's pride. They had established a sophisticated system of territorial marking and patrolling that kept other predators and potential challengers at bay. They hunted the abundant prey with efficiency, growing fat and lazy on the riches of the land. They had also begun to breed with the surviving lionesses of the original pride, their cubs already being born and raised under Karanja's dominance. This was perhaps the most troubling aspect of what Simba observed. In another generation, Karanja's genetic line would have effectively replaced their mother's lineage. The history of their ancestors would be erased, written over by the story of Karanja's conquest. But Simba also discovered something that would prove critical to their strategy. Karanja was developing a pattern of complacency. The rogue male had begun to believe that his position was so secure, his dominance so absolute, that he no longer needed to remain constantly vigilant. He spent his days resting in the shade, playing with his cubs, enjoying the fruits of his conquest. He left the patrolling of borders to his subordinates, trusting that no challenger would be foolish enough to confront him directly. This overconfidence, this belief in his own invincibility, was the crack in his armor that Kavi and Simba could exploit. The brothers called their coalition together for a final strategy meeting beneath an ancient acacia tree that stood like a guardian over the grasslands. The branches spread wide enough to provide shelter from the merciless sun, and the location was far enough from Karanja's territory that they could speak freely without fear of being discovered. Kavi laid out the plan with the precision of a general preparing for a war. They would move in 2 groups. The first group, led by Jabari and consisting of Amari and Darius, would approach from the east, creating a visible threat that would draw Karanja's attention and force his coalition to respond. This would be the bait, the thing that made Karanja believe he was being challenged in a traditional territorial dispute. The second group, led by Kavi and Simba, would circle wide to the north and west, moving through terrain that was more difficult but less heavily patrolled. They would position themselves to strike at Karanja while his attention was focused on the false threat from the east. The strategy relied on speed, coordination, and the element of surprise. It also relied on Karanja's arrogance. They were counting on him to respond aggressively to the challenge from Jabari's group, to meet force with force in a direct confrontation rather than retreating or fortifying his position. Simba spoke for the first time during the planning session, his voice quiet but filled with absolute certainty. Karanja will respond to the challenge, he said, not because he needs to, but because his pride won't allow him to do anything else. He has spent years building a reputation as an unstoppable force. If he retreats or hides, that reputation shatters. He will come, and he will come with fury. And that is when we strike. Every lion present understood the truth in those words. They had all witnessed the power of reputation in lion society, understood how a male's standing was directly tied to his willingness to fight and his perceived invincibility. The final piece of the strategy involved something more subtle and psychologically sophisticated. Kavi proposed that they would not fight to kill Karanja immediately. Instead, they would wound him, humiliate him, prove that he was not the invincible force he believed himself to be. They would let him survive the first encounter, injured and terrified, experiencing for the first time the sensation of being hunted rather than being the hunter. And then, when his confidence was shattered and his coalition was fractured by doubt, they would finish him. The other males understood the brilliance of this approach. It was not just about victory, it was about justice. It was about making Karanja experience, in some small way, the same fear and helplessness that Ayana had experienced in her final moments. As the sun began to set on the day of their planning, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Kavi stood and addressed the coalition one final time. He spoke of Ayana, describing her grace and intelligence, her courage and her kindness. He spoke of Zuri, their mother, who had fought so hard to protect her children and her territory, only to be defeated by treachery and overwhelming numbers. He spoke of all the innocent lions who had been killed or displaced by Karanja's ruthless conquest. And then he made a vow that would echo through the Serengeti for generations to come. "Tomorrow," Kavi said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "we reclaim what was taken. Tomorrow, we honor those who were lost. Tomorrow we prove that justice, however delayed, will eventually be served. Karanja will answer for his crimes, and the lands of our ancestors will know peace once more." The 5 males roared together that night, a sound so powerful that it carried across miles of grassland, reaching even to the ears of Karanja's coalition camped in the distance. It was a declaration of war, a challenge written in the language of thunder and rage. Karanja heard that roar and laughed. He believed himself invincible. He could not imagine that anything in the Serengeti posed a genuine threat to him. This was his greatest weakness, the blind spot that would lead to his downfall. That night, as Karanja rested beneath the stars with his coalition around him, he had no idea that death was coming. He had no idea that the universe had finally balanced its scales, that justice was about to be served with claws and fangs, that the ghosts of Ayana and Zuri were preparing to exact a terrible price. The night before the confrontation was sleepless for Kavi and Simba. They lay side by side in the tall grass, not speaking, just being present with each other. The bond that had been fractured years ago had been healed through shared purpose and united effort. The brothers no longer blamed each other for what had happened to Ayana. They understood that they had been children, powerless against overwhelming force, victims of circumstance rather than failures of will. Their journey of the past years, the solitary training, the development of individual strength, had all been necessary steps leading them to this moment. As dawn began to break over the African plains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, Jabari, Amari, and Darius moved into position from the east. They moved slowly, deliberately, making sure their presence was known, ensuring that every member of Karanja's coalition was aware that a challenge had been issued. Meanwhile, Kavi and Simba led their portion of the journey north and west, moving through more challenging terrain with practiced efficiency. The confrontation, when it came, was explosive and brutal. Jabari emerged from the tall grass with a roar that shook the earth, immediately engaging Karanja in direct combat. The massive males crashed together like two mountains colliding, their bodies meeting with bone-jarring force. Dust exploded into the air as they grappled, each trying to establish dominance. Behind Jabari, Amari, and Darius engaged with two of Karanja's subordinates, their synchronized attacks quickly overwhelming their opponents and driving them back. Karanja, absorbed in his battle with Jabari, did not see Kavi and Simba until they were upon him. The two brothers struck from his blind spot simultaneously, one going for his left flank while the other targeted his shoulder. Karanja roared in shock and pain, suddenly realizing that he was surrounded, that he was facing overwhelming numbers and coordinated tactics that he had never encountered before. What unfolded over the next several minutes was not a quick victory, but a methodical dismantling of Karanja's dominance. The five lions worked with such coordination, such precision, that Karanja could not focus on any single opponent without being attacked from another direction. He was strong, devastatingly strong, and he inflicted serious injuries on both Jabari and Darius. But strength alone could not overcome the superior tactics and numbers. He was being hunted, and for the first time in his life, Karanja understood what it felt like to be prey. The battle raged across the savannah like a storm given physical form. Karanja, despite his enormous size and legendary strength, was being systematically overwhelmed by the coordinated assault of the five lions. His coalition, realizing that their leader was in genuine danger, attempted to rally to his defense, but they too found themselves outmatched by the superior tactics and unity of purpose that Kavi and Simba had instilled in their group. What had once been a solid coalition of 7 confident warriors had become a fragmented force, each member fighting individual battles rather than functioning as a unified whole. One of Karanja's lieutenants, a scarred male named Kendo, who had been with the rogue coalition for nearly 3 years, suddenly broke and ran. He had fought countless territorial disputes, had participated in the conquest of multiple prides, had believed himself part of an unstoppable force, but watching Karanja struggle against overwhelming odds, watching his leader bleed from multiple wounds and stumble under relentless attacks, something broke inside Kendo's warrior spirit. He recognized, in that moment, that this was not a battle they could win. This was an execution in progress, and he chose survival over loyalty. The departure of Kendo triggered a cascade of psychological collapse throughout Karanja's coalition. If even one of their number could abandon them, then perhaps the entire mythology of their invincibility was a lie. A second male, younger and less experienced, also turned and fled. This left only 4 of Karanja's original coalition fighting alongside him, and against 5 disciplined warriors, 4 was not enough. Jabari, bleeding from a deep gash across his shoulder inflicted by Karanja's claws, continued to press his attack with unrelenting fury. He understood that this was not just a territorial dispute. This was the culmination of years of grief and rage, a final reckoning for the death of his son. Every strike he delivered carried the weight of that loss, the accumulated pain of years spent watching Karanja's atrocities go unpunished. When Jabari's jaws finally connected with Karanja's left foreleg, the massive rogue male let out a scream of genuine agony. The bone had been damaged, the leg no longer capable of bearing his full weight. Kavi and Simba, working in perfect synchronization, continued their assault from different angles. Kavi targeted Karanja's vulnerable spots, going for the throat whenever the massive male was distracted by Jabari's attacks. Simba, smaller and more agile than his brother, used his speed to dart in and out, striking with precision and then retreating before Karanja could retaliate. They had spent months training for this exact scenario, had visualized this moment countless times, had prepared both physically and mentally for the confrontation that would either redeem them or destroy them. As the battle continued, a subtle shift began to occur in the dynamics of combat. Karanja, despite his size and strength, was gradually being forced backward, away from his territory, toward more vulnerable ground. The 5 lions were essentially herding him like prey, using their coordinated movements to limit his options and control the flow of battle. This was a level of tactical sophistication that was rarely seen among lions, typically reserved for lionesses hunting buffalo or large antelope. But Kavi and Simba had learned their lessons well from their years of observation and planning. Amari and Darius, who had been engaged with 2 of Karanja's subordinates, suddenly broke off their attacks as those 2 males retreated, unwilling to continue fighting against overwhelming odds. The 2 brothers then joined the assault on Karanja himself, creating a 5-on-1 situation that was, quite simply, devastation incarnate. Karanja was trapped, wounded, bleeding from a dozen different wounds, his movements becoming increasingly sluggish as blood loss and fatigue began to take their toll. It was at this moment, as Karanja stumbled and nearly fell, that Kavi stepped back and allowed the assault to pause for just a moment. The massive rogue male, breathing heavily, his golden eyes wild with pain and terror, looked up at his attackers, and in that moment of clarity, recognition flickered across his scarred face. He saw Kavi and understood, with a terrible certainty, exactly who these lions were. He had killed their sister years ago, had tormented their mother, had stolen their heritage, and now, finally, they had come for him. Simba approached slowly, deliberately, his dark mane catching the light as he moved. He stood directly in front of Karanja, and for a long moment, the two lions stared at each other. Simba's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a weight that transcended the physical realm. "Do you remember us?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with absolute conviction. "Do you remember the cubs you slaughtered? Do you remember Ayana? Do you remember the terror in her eyes as you took her life?" Karanja tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but no words came. What could he possibly say? There was no excuse for what he had done, no justification for his cruelty. "My sister was innocent," Simba continued, his voice growing harder. "She had done nothing to you, threatened nothing that belonged to you. You killed her for sport, for dominance, for the simple satisfaction of exercising your strength over something weak and defenseless. And my mother, Zuri, died trying to protect what was hers, trying to preserve our family's heritage. You stole from us. You took everything." Kavi stepped forward now, and his voice carried the authority of the eldest, the weight of leadership that he had carried since that terrible day years ago. "We could have killed you quickly," Kavi said. "We could have ended this without the hours of torment you are experiencing. But we chose not to, because justice requires that you understand what you have done, that you experience, at least in some small measure, the fear and pain that you inflicted on others. You made our sister suffer, you made our mother suffer, and now finally you will suffer as well." What happened next was not a quick execution, but a calculated series of strikes designed to inflict maximum psychological damage along with the physical wounds. Kavi, Simba, Jabari, Amari and Darius took turns attacking, each one delivering blows with precision and purpose, but always leaving Karanja alive, always leaving him conscious enough to feel the full weight of his fate. They broke his legs, one by one, ensuring that even if he somehow survived this day, he would never hunt again, never run again, never command respect through displays of physical dominance. They scarred his face so thoroughly that his legendary appearance was transformed into something grotesque and broken. This was not simply violence. This was justice served with surgical precision. This was a message being written in blood and broken bone, a story being told to the entire Serengeti about the consequences of preying on the innocent. Other predators watching from a distance, herbivores pausing in their grazing to observe the spectacle. Even the birds circling overhead seemed to understand that they were witnessing something profound and transformative. By the time Karanja's suffering finally ended, hours had passed since the initial confrontation had begun. The rogue male's body lay broken and bloodied on the golden grass, a monument to his own cruelty and the price it had extracted. Kavi stood over the fallen tyrant, breathing heavily, his own body bearing the marks of the brutal battle. Simba stood at his brother's side, and together they looked down at the beast that had haunted their dreams and dominated their waking thoughts for so many years. It was over. The hunt was complete. The oath had been fulfilled. But as the adrenaline began to fade, and the reality of what they had accomplished started to sink in, Kavi and Simba felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Instead, what they felt was a profound emptiness, a hollow space where the burning purpose that had sustained them for years had been. For so long they had defined themselves by this quest, by this singular goal of avenging their sister and honoring their mother. And now that goal had been achieved, they faced an uncertain future without that guiding star. The other members of the coalition gathered around them, celebrating the victory with roars that echoed across the plains. Jabari approached Kavi and placed his massive head against the younger lion's shoulder, a gesture of respect and camaraderie. "It is done," Jabari said simply. "The debt has been paid. Your sister and mother can rest now. Their memory has been honored." Amari and Darius also came forward, their faces streaked with blood, their bodies exhausted but their spirits elevated by the knowledge that they had fought for something greater than themselves. But as the sun began to set on that momentous day, painting the sky in shades of crimson and violet, Kavi found himself standing alone, separated from the others, staring out across the vast expanse of the Serengeti. Beside him, Simba approached silently, understanding instinctively what his brother was feeling. The two brothers stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the light fade from the sky, each lost in their own thoughts. "What happens now?" Simba asked quietly. "We have spent so many years focused on this moment. What do we do when there is no more enemy to face, no more purpose driving us forward?" Kavi was silent for a long time before answering. "Now," he said finally, "we rebuild. We take this territory that Karanja conquered, that our mother died defending, and we make it whole again. We establish our own pride, stronger and more just than what came before. We ensure that no tyrant like Karanja ever rises again, that the innocent are protected and the cruel are held accountable." Simba nodded slowly, understanding that his brother had found a new purpose, a new direction for all the skills and strength they had developed. "Together?" he asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in that single word, a reminder of the young cubs who had been separated by trauma but were now being reunited by choice and shared vision. "Together," Kavi confirmed. "Always together. That is the promise we make to Ayana and Zuri. That is the oath we swear on this blood-soaked earth." The following days revealed the full extent of what Karanja's coalition had done to the lands they had conquered. The surviving lionesses of the original pride were traumatized, broken by years of forced breeding with the rogue males, their spirits crushed by the loss of their freedom and dignity. Cubs born from these forced unions were being raised with the values of their brutal fathers rather than the noble traditions of their mother's lineage. The prey animals, hunted ruthlessly by Karanja's constantly expanding coalition, were dangerously depleted. The entire ecosystem of the region had been thrown out of balance by years of unchecked predation and territorial disruption. Kavi and Simba took on the work of restoration with the same dedication and precision they had brought to their quest for vengeance. They worked with Jabari, Amari, and Darius to establish a new coalition that would serve as the protective force for the reclaimed lands. But unlike Karanja's brutal domination through fear, Kavi established a rule based on justice and responsibility. The strong would protect the weak, the hunters would sustain those who could not hunt for themselves. Territory would be defended not for the sake of conquest, but for the preservation of life and the maintenance of ecological balance. Word of what had happened spread rapidly through the Serengeti. Lions traveling through the region heard the story of the two brothers who had spent years preparing their revenge, who had defeated the legendary Karanja and his coalition, who had chosen restoration over continued violence. The tale became legend, repeated around watering holes and under acacia trees, growing with each telling until Kavi and Simba became mythological figures, symbols of justice and redemption. More significantly, young lions who had been exiled or displaced by Karanja's tyranny began to gravitate toward the newly established pride. They recognized in Kavi and Simba something different from the typical alpha male dominance hierarchy. They saw leaders who had suffered loss and transformed that loss into purpose, who had overcome personal trauma to build something greater than themselves. Within 6 months of Karanja's death, Kavi and Simba's pride had grown to include nearly 30 lions, making it one of the largest and most formidable prides in the entire Serengeti. The lionesses of the original pride, particularly Zuri's old companions, gradually began to show signs of healing. They were no longer forced to breed against their will. They were no longer hunted by their own territory's males for the simple purpose of establishing dominance. Instead, they were valued members of a community that recognized their intelligence, their hunting prowess, and their role as the true foundation of any stable pride. Many of them came to regard Kavi and Simba as worthy successors to Zuri, as lions who had vindicated her memory through their actions and their commitment to justice. One of the most symbolic moments came about 8 months after Karanja's death, when Kavi and Simba led their expanded pride back to the exact location where Ayana had been killed years before. Rangers who were tracking the pride documented what happened next. The lions gathered in a solemn circle, and Kavi stood at the center, his magnificent dark mane catching the light of the setting sun. He roared a roar that carried such weight and emotion that even the researchers watching were moved to tears. "We are here," Kavi proclaimed, his voice carrying across the grasslands, "to honor those who were lost, to remember those who suffered, to acknowledge the justice that has been served. Ayana, our beloved sister, your memory lives on in every action we take, in every life we protect, in every predator we hold accountable. Your death was not meaningless. It was the catalyst that transformed us from victims into warriors, from broken cubs into lions worthy of your sacrifice." Simba stepped forward then, and his voice joined his brothers in a harmony that seemed to resonate with the very essence of the Serengeti itself. "Zuri, our mother, You fought for this land, for this family, for the legacy of our ancestors. You did not die in vain. Your death drove us to become the protectors you always believed we could be. We carry your strength in our hearts, your wisdom in our actions, your love in everything we do." The other lions of the pride added their roars to this chorus of remembrance, creating a symphony of sound that echoed across the plains and seemed to carry a message to the spirits of the fallen. Your memory endures, your sacrifice is honored, your legacy continues. In that moment, standing beneath the vast African sky with their pride united around them, Kavi and Simba finally experienced the peace that had eluded them for so many years. The transformation of the conquered territory under Kavi and Simba's leadership was remarkable. The prey populations, no longer being hunted into extinction by a coalition focused on dominance rather than sustainability, began to rebound. Herds of wildebeest returned to grasslands they had abandoned. Zebras established themselves once more in the river valleys. Buffalo, which had been nearly absent for years, began to show themselves in increasing numbers. The ecosystem, thrown so violently out of balance by Karanja's reign of terror, slowly began to heal. Kavi proved to be not just a warrior, but an intelligent administrator of territory. He established patrol routes that ensured all parts of the pride's lands were regularly checked and protected. He made decisions about which predators to tolerate and which to drive out, based on careful consideration of ecological impact rather than simple displays of dominance. He worked with other lion prides in the region to establish a loose alliance that prevented any single coalition from becoming too powerful, from repeating Karanja's pattern of brutal conquest. Simba, meanwhile, became the primary strategist for the pride, planning hunts with the same precision he had brought to his reconnaissance before Karanja's defeat. He taught the younger lions sophisticated hunting techniques that maximized success while minimizing waste. He developed systems that allowed the pride to hunt efficiently during times of plenty, preserving meat through clever positioning and strategic caching for times when prey was scarce. His methods became studied by other prides, and over time they began to spread throughout the Serengeti, improving hunting success rates across the region. But perhaps the most significant legacy that Kavi and Simba established was a new model of lion leadership that prioritized justice and accountability. When young males challenged their authority, they were not simply driven off or killed, as was traditional in lion society. Instead, Kavi and Simba evaluated each challenger, understanding their motivations and circumstances. If a young male had simply grown too large for the pride and needed to establish his own territory, they would allow him to leave with honor and occasionally assistance. But if a male showed signs of the kind of brutality and ruthlessness that had characterized Karanja, if he demonstrated a propensity for cruelty and dominance for its own sake, then swift and absolute justice was administered. This approach created a subtle cultural shift throughout lion society in the Serengeti region. Young males began to understand that strength and brutality were no longer the only paths to respect and status. Intelligence, fair judgment, and commitment to the welfare of those under one's protection became increasingly valued traits. The story of Karanja's downfall, the tale of how a tyrant who had seemed invincible had been brought low by brothers united in purpose, became a cautionary tale that was told and retold, shaping the values and behaviors of an entire generation of lions. Years passed, and Kavi and Simba's pride grew stronger and more stable. Cubs were born from the original lionesses of the territory, cubs who would grow up knowing only peace and justice, who would never experience the terror that their mothers had endured under Karanja's rule. These cubs, carrying the bloodlines of both the original pride and the new leadership, represented a new era for the Serengeti, a healing of old wounds and the establishment of something better than what had come before. Jabari remained with the pride as a senior advisor and protector, his massive frame a constant reminder of the battle that had changed everything. Amari and Darius eventually chose to move on, using the skills they had developed and the reputation they had earned to establish their own territories and pride structures in neighboring regions. But they maintained contact with Kavi and Simba, would occasionally visit during major gatherings, and served as ambassadors for the new model of leadership that the brothers were establishing. One particular afternoon, about 5 years after Karanja's defeat, Kavi and Simba found themselves sitting together beneath the same ancient acacia tree where they had planned their rebellion all those years before. The light was golden, the temperature was cooling as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, and for a moment it seemed as though time had stopped, allowing them to reflect on the long journey they had traveled from that terrible day when their sister had been taken from them. "Do you think she would be proud?" Simba asked quietly, and there was no need to specify who she meant. They both knew he was referring to Ayana, their beloved sister, whose memory had been the driving force behind everything they had accomplished. Kavi was silent for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he finally said, "she would be proud, not because we killed Karanja, but because we transformed our grief into something meaningful. We took the worst day of our lives and used it to create something better, something that protects the innocent and holds the cruel accountable. That is the kind of legacy that Ayana would have wanted." Simba nodded, and the two brothers sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. They had been separated by trauma, had grown up isolated from each other, each carrying the weight of loss and failure. But they had found their way back to each other, had rebuilt their bond through shared purpose and united effort, and in doing so, they had not only avenged their fallen sister and honored their fallen mother, they had fundamentally transformed their corner of the world, had created a legacy that would endure far beyond their own lifetimes. The years that followed Karanja's defeat were transformative, not just for Kavi and Simba, but for the entire Serengeti ecosystem. The brothers' pride grew to nearly 50 lions, making it one of the largest and most influential coalitions in the region. But what made them truly exceptional was not their size or their hunting prowess, but the philosophy of leadership that Kavi and Simba had established. They had taken the trauma of their youth, the burning rage of their quest for vengeance, and transformed it into something constructive and enduring. They had proven that strength could be wielded not just as a tool of domination, but as a force for justice and protection. By the time Kavi and Simba reached their 13th year, an age that very few male lions ever attained in the wild, their names had become legendary throughout the Serengeti and beyond. Researchers studying the lions of East Africa made their pride a primary focus of study, analyzing the sophisticated social structures and hunting strategies that seemed to set Kavi and Simba apart from every other lion coalition ever documented. Academic papers were written, documentary filmmakers requested access, tourists came from around the world, hoping to catch a glimpse of the two legendary brothers whose story had captured the imagination of millions. But perhaps the most significant testament to their legacy came in an unexpected form. One day, a young male lion arrived at the borders of their territory. He was lean and scarred, clearly having survived a difficult life on the margins of lion society. He introduced himself as Kion, and he carried with him a remarkable story. Kion's mother had been a lioness in one of the prides that Karanja had conquered and brutally dominated years before. She had been forced to breed with Karanja and one of his lieutenants, producing Kion as the result of that violence. But she had managed to escape the pride's territory when Kion was still very young, taking her son to the furthest reaches of the Serengeti where Karanja's influence did not reach. As Kion had grown into adolescence, his mother had told him the story of what had happened to her, of the brutal years under Karanja's rule, and then of the miraculous liberation that had come when two brothers named Kavi and Simba had defeated the tyrant and restored justice to the lands. She had told Kion that despite his blood heritage, despite the fact that his biological father was one of the cruelest predators ever to walk the Serengeti, he had a choice about what kind of lion he would become. He could follow in his father's footsteps, embracing brutality and domination, or he could seek out Kavi and Simba and learn a different way. When Kion's mother passed away, the young lion had made his decision. He had traveled across the Serengeti, following rumors and stories, until he found the territory of Kavi and Simba's pride. He arrived at their borders not as a challenger, not as a threat, but as a supplicant, asking to be allowed to join their pride and learn from their example. Kavi and Simba's response to Kion's request was instructive and revealed much about the principles they had come to live by. They did not immediately accept him into the pride. Instead, they subjected him to a rigorous testing period, observing his behavior, his treatment of other lions, his response to authority and challenge. They wanted to understand, with absolute certainty, whether Kion was genuinely seeking redemption and a different path, or whether he was simply trying to infiltrate their pride with the intention of undermining their leadership. Over the course of 3 months, Kion demonstrated his commitment to the values that Kavi and Simba had established. He hunted cooperatively with the pride, never attempting to dominate or take more than his fair share. He showed kindness to the younger cubs and respect to the older lionesses. He accepted correction without defensiveness and continuously worked to improve his understanding of the pride's philosophy. By the end of the testing period, both brothers had come to the same conclusion. Kion was a lion who had been born into a terrible legacy, but was choosing to forge a different path. They welcomed him into the pride with full membership, treating him not as an outsider or an unwelcome addition, but as a true member of their family. This decision sent a powerful message throughout lion society. Kavi and Simba were not just punishing the cruel and protecting the innocent. They were also offering redemption to those who sought it, offering a path away from the brutality that had characterized their world for so long. The acceptance of Kion, a lion who bore Karanja's blood, demonstrated that the brothers had transcended simple revenge and had truly embraced a philosophy of justice and transformation. But not everyone in the Serengeti region was pleased with the changes that Kavi and Simba had brought about. There were older lions, traditional in their thinking, who believed that the brothers' methods of leadership were too soft, too concerned with fairness and ethics, not ruthless enough to maintain absolute dominance. There were younger males who chafed under the restrictions that the brothers imposed, males who believed that strength should be expressed through conquest and domination rather than protection and responsibility. Over the years, several challenges were issued to Kavi and Simba's authority, testing whether they could maintain their position against rivals who subscribed to a more traditional model of lion leadership. Each of these challenges was met with swift and decisive action, but notably Kavi and Simba never simply killed their challengers. Instead, they would defeat them in combat, wound them appropriately to demonstrate their superiority, and then offer them a choice: leave the territory and establish themselves elsewhere, or stay and accept the authority of the pride's leadership and abide by its laws and ethics. Most chose to leave, but a few chose to stay, drawn by the opportunity to live in a society where they could be strong without being cruel, where they could protect others without dominating them, where they could find purpose beyond simple predatory survival. 10 years after Karanja's defeat, when Kavi and Simba were both in their early 20s and beginning to show the first signs of age that would eventually overtake even the strongest of lions, an event occurred that brought full circle the entire saga that had defined their lives. Rangers conducting a survey of the pride's territory discovered something remarkable in a remote section of the grasslands. There, in a sheltered depression surrounded by acacia trees, were the remains of a young lioness. The skeleton was old, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, but the arrangement of the bones and the distinctive scarring on some of them made identification possible. It was Ayana, or rather, it was all that remained of her. Years after her death, her body had been abandoned by the scavengers that had initially fed on it, and the bones had gradually weathered and scattered. But the discovery, accidental as it was, provided an opportunity for closure that neither Kavi nor Simba had anticipated. The rangers brought the news to the pride, understanding the significance of what had been found. Kavi and Simba organized a formal memorial ceremony, gathering the entire pride to honor their fallen sister and to acknowledge the long journey that had led them from that terrible day of loss to this moment of remembrance and peace. They had the bones carefully collected and transported to a sacred location near the den where their mother had raised them, a place that had become something of a spiritual center for the pride. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the rangers had ever witnessed. For hours, the lions of the pride gathered around the remains of Ayana, and Kavi spoke about his sister. He described her intelligence, her grace, her kindness to others. He recounted memories of her as a cub, of the games they had played, of the bond they had shared. And then he spoke of the terrible day she had been taken from them, of the rage and despair that had consumed him and Simba, of the long years of preparation and planning that had ultimately led to Karanja's defeat. But what Kavi emphasized, more than anything else, was that Ayana's legacy was not one of victimhood or tragedy. Her legacy was one of transformation and healing. Her death, terrible as it was, had inspired her brothers to become something greater than they would have been otherwise. It had pushed them to develop the strength, wisdom and justice that had ultimately saved not just their own family, but dozens of other lions and entire ecosystems that had been destined for ruin under Karanja's rule. "My sister," Kavi said, his voice carrying across the gathered pride with the weight of absolute conviction, was not just a victim of violence. She was a catalyst for change. Her memory does not haunt us with sorrow, though we mourn her loss. Instead, her memory inspires us daily to be better, stronger, more just than we would otherwise be. Every kindness we show, every innocent life we protect, every predator we hold accountable for cruelty, we do in her name and in her honor. Simba then approached the remains of their sister and lay down beside them, his massive body curling protectively around the fragile skeleton, as if he could somehow guard her in death as he had failed to guard her in life. For a long time he did not speak. The other lions of the pride watched in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing a deeply personal moment between the brothers and their sister's memory. When Simba finally rose, his eyes were dry, but there was a calmness to his bearing that suggested a final healing had occurred. "She is no longer lost," Simba said quietly. "She is no longer abandoned and forgotten. She has been found, and she has been honored, and in her honor, we will continue the work of building a world where her death will never again be repeated, where the innocent will be protected, and where those who prey upon the defenseless will be held accountable. This is our promise to Ayana. This is our eternal oath." In the months that followed the discovery and honoring of Ayana's remains, Kavi and Simba made a decision that would further cement their legacy. They established what the rangers began to call a sanctuary system within their territory and neighboring allied prides. Certain areas were designated as protected zones where younger cubs and vulnerable lions could take refuge without fear of predation or exploitation. These sanctuaries were fiercely defended by the strongest members of each pride, and any lion who violated the sanctuary's sanctity faced swift and severe consequences. The sanctuary system was revolutionary in lion society. For the first time, protection of the young and vulnerable became institutionalized, enshrined in the laws and ethics of lion culture. It spread from Kavi and Simba's territory to allied prides, and gradually, over the course of several years, became a more widespread practice throughout the Serengeti region. Young cubs that would previously have been vulnerable to predation by rogue males or rival coalitions now had places of safety where they could grow and develop. But perhaps the most profound impact of Kavi and Simba's legacy was less tangible but ultimately more significant. They had fundamentally altered the narrative of what it meant to be a powerful lion. In the traditional model that had dominated lion culture for millennia, power was expressed through domination, through the ability to defeat rivals and claim territory and females, through violence and conquest. Kavi and Simba had demonstrated an alternative model where power was expressed through the ability to protect others, through wisdom in the administration of justice, through the building of communities and relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear. This shift in values rippled outward in ways that neither brother could have predicted. Young male lions who might have traditionally sought to prove themselves through brutal conquest instead began to seek training from prides that operated under the Kavi and Simba model. They learned sophisticated hunting strategies that allowed them to feed their families without devastating prey populations. They learned conflict resolution techniques that allowed disputes to be settled without widespread violence. They learned what it meant to be a guardian of a territory rather than simply a conqueror of it. As Kavi entered his mid-20s, showing increasingly obvious signs of age, he began to deliberately train younger males to eventually take over leadership of the pride. He selected not the largest or most aggressive males, but rather those who demonstrated intelligence, fairness, and commitment to the principles he and Simba had established. This transition planning was another innovation that was unprecedented in typical lion society, where leadership transitions usually occurred through violent struggle and often resulted in the death of previous leaders. Simba, meanwhile, focused his energy on documenting and transmitting the knowledge of sophisticated hunting and survival strategies to the next generation. He worked closely with the young lions, teaching them not just how to hunt, but why certain strategies were more effective than others, encouraging them to think critically about their approaches and to adapt techniques to different circumstances and prey animals. By the time both brothers reached their late 20s, an age that very few wild lions ever achieved, they had begun to withdraw gradually from the day-to-day leadership of the pride. They were still present, still consulted on major decisions, still respected and honored by every member of the pride, but they were no longer the primary decision-makers or the daily administrators of justice. Instead, they had transitioned into roles as advisors and mentors, allowing the younger generation to take on the responsibility of leading the pride forward. One final moment crystallized the magnitude of what Kavi and Simba had accomplished. Approximately 22 years after Karanja's death, a massive gathering of lions from throughout the Serengeti region convened near the borders of Kavi and Simba's territory. The gathering was called to discuss regional cooperation in hunting and territorial management. Representatives from dozens of prides arrived, including lionesses who had been part of the original pride that their mother Zuri had led, including males who had been exiled or displaced by Karanja and had eventually found their way to Kavi and Simba's coalition, including young lions who had been born after Karanja's death but had grown up hearing stories of the legendary brothers. During this gathering, The senior members of all the allied prides formally acknowledged Kavi and Simba's leadership and their contributions to the region. They spoke of how the brothers had not just created a strong and successful pride, but had fundamentally transformed lion culture in their region. They had made it possible for intelligence and justice to compete with brutality and dominance as measures of strength and worth. They had created systems and structures that protected the vulnerable and held the cruel accountable. They had demonstrated that it was possible to be powerful and compassionate, to be strong and ethical, to be a leader in the truest sense. At the conclusion of the gathering, the assembled lions performed a ceremonial roar unlike any that had ever been documented. Led by the oldest females, who had the deepest memories of life before and after Karanja, the entire assembly roared in unison, their voices creating a sound so profound and moving that researchers watching from nearby felt chills running down their spines. The roar was not a challenge or a territorial declaration. It was a roar of honor, of respect, of acknowledgement of the transformative journey that Kavi and Simba had undertaken and completed. Kavi and Simba, now showing their age with silver beginning to show in their manes and a certain stiffness in their movements, roared in response. Their voices, still powerful despite their advanced years, carried across the plains with all the authority and presence they had commanded in their youth. And in that moment, standing among the lions they had served and protected, surrounded by the legacy they had created, the two brothers finally experienced a peace that went beyond the resolution of their quest for vengeance. The final years of Kavi and Simba's lives were marked by increasing frailty, but also by a profound sense of purpose fulfilled. They spent their time mentoring the youngest generation, sharing the wisdom they had accumulated through decades of leadership and struggle. They told stories of Ayana and Zuri, ensuring that future generations would remember the fallen and understand why the values of justice and protection mattered so deeply. They watched as the sanctuary system they had established protected thousands of young cubs from predation and exploitation. Simba passed away first, during a particularly harsh dry season, when he was nearly 30 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by pride members who had known him his entire life. The ceremonial mourning that followed lasted for days, with lions from throughout the region traveling to the territory to pay their respects. They remembered Simba not as a warrior or a conqueror, but as a healer, a transformer of trauma into wisdom, a brother whose dedication to justice had fundamentally altered the trajectory of an entire species' culture. Kavi followed his brother into the next realm approximately 18 months later, at the advanced age of 31. Rangers who had been tracking the pride for decades recorded his passing as one of the most significant natural events they had ever documented. The old lion simply lay down one morning and did not rise. Those who found him said his expression was peaceful, satisfied, as if he had finally completed the work that had defined his existence. The legacy of Kavi and Simba's lives did not end with their deaths. In fact, it continued to grow and expand in ways that neither brother could have anticipated. The sanctuary system spread throughout the Serengeti and into neighboring regions, eventually becoming a standard practice among the most progressive and successful prides. The model of leadership that emphasized justice, protection, and ethical conduct continued to attract young lions, seeking an alternative to the brutality that had characterized lion society for millennia. But perhaps the most profound testament to their legacy came in the realm of cultural memory. The story of the two brothers who had suffered loss, who had spent years preparing themselves for vengeance, who had ultimately defeated a tyrant and used that victory to build something better and more just, became one of the most important narratives in African lion culture. It was told and retold around watering holes, shared between prides, incorporated into the teaching of young cubs. It became a touchstone, a reference point, a source of inspiration for lions facing their own struggles and seeking to understand the relationship between strength and ethics, between power and responsibility. Researchers studying lion behavior noted that after Kavi and Simba's death, there was measurable change in the behavioral patterns of lions throughout the Serengeti region. Infanticide rates declined, hunting efficiency increased, territorial disputes, while still occurring, became less likely to result in total annihilation of defeated coalitions. The pride structures became more stable, with clearer lines of succession and more peaceful transitions of power. These changes were not all directly attributable to Kavi and Simba, but the cultural shift they had initiated had clearly influenced the direction of lion evolution and behavior. The territories that Kavi and Simba had once controlled remained among the most stable and successful in the entire Serengeti ecosystem for generations after their deaths. The pride they had founded continued to thrive under the leadership of the younger males they had carefully trained and mentored. The sanctuary system they had established protected countless generations of young lions. The values of justice and protection that they had embedded in the culture of their pride became part of the spiritual and ethical foundation upon which subsequent generations built their lives. In the end, the story of Kavi and Simba is not simply a tale of revenge successfully enacted. It is a story about the transformative power of loss, about how trauma can be converted into purpose, about how individual suffering can be channeled into broader social good. It is a story about brotherhood, about how two individuals separated by grief and guilt can find their way back to each other and, in reuniting, transform not just themselves but their entire world. The two brothers had failed to protect their sister in her moment of greatest need. They had been cubs, powerless against overwhelming force, unable to prevent the tragedy that had destroyed the innocence of their youth. But from that failure, from that loss, from that trauma, they had drawn inspiration to become something greater than they would have been otherwise. They had become protectors on a scale that saved countless lives. They had become seekers of justice who fundamentally altered the ethics and values of their society. They had become legends whose influence continued to shape the behavior and choices of generations they would never meet. And so the story of Kavi and Simba lives on, carried forward in the hearts and minds of every lion who has been touched by their legacy, every cub who has been protected by the sanctuaries they established, every predator who has chosen the path of ethical strength over brutal domination. Their sister Ayana, taken so violently and so young, became not a victim to be forgotten, but a catalyst for transformation, whose memory continues to inspire justice and compassion in a world that desperately needs both. The Serengeti, that vast and timeless landscape where the story began with loss and brutality, had been forever changed by the journey of two brothers who had refused to accept that tragedy was the final word. Instead, they had written a new ending, not just for themselves, but for their entire species. And in doing so, they had proven that even in a world ruled by tooth and claw, by strength and survival, it is possible for justice and compassion to prevail. This is their story, this is their legacy, and this is the promise that they left behind for all who come after them, that even the deepest wounds can be healed, that even the most terrible losses can be transformed into meaning, and that brotherhood, true and enduring brotherhood, can move mountains and reshape the world.